Okay, so in Chapter 8, we're talking about sales and operations planning. And basically, in most of the roles that I had at both Burnham and at Pella, I played some function in terms of the sales and operations planning part of it. Mostly at Pella, it was about taking what we were going to do on the production floor and matching it to the sales forecast. But they have kind of an overview of how that's done in this, and I think it runs pretty true to form in terms of at least how Pella performs that operation of matching sales and operations planning. And the thing to remember is that it's not a top-down sales goes to operations, it's a side-by-side, because you have to understand what your capacity is before you make some of the decisions with what you think you're going to be able to do in sales. Because if you incentivize people to sell something that can't be produced, right, you've set up just a natural frustration. And so that's why the two functional areas need to be communicating. And so it's how do we coordinate manufacturing, logistics, services, and marketing plans. And so what we try to do is we do aggregate plans that employ different strategies for meeting the demand. So once we kind of decide on what it is, the second thing of what we're going to work on here is how do we decide how we're going to produce it? Because there's a lot of different options, right? I can hire a bunch of people and produce inventory and store it and then use it when I get to peak demand, and never have to work overtime, or I can hire some people, maybe work some overtime, or I can not hire anybody and then subcontract, right, or work all overtime. So there's all these different mixes and matches. And so again, that's kind of what we're going to look at today is how do we decide what our best approach is. And then we're also going to talk about what's yield management and why that's an important strategy for leveling demand as well. So sales and operations planning is this process that helps your firm provide better customer service, because you can provide that customer service with lower inventory, which means you have lower capital invested, which means that you move things through your business faster, which is a win in terms of from the time you spend $1 on your raw materials to the time that you get the $1 back from your customer. So lower inventory is better from that standpoint. You can shorten your customer lead times, you can have maybe more stable production rates, and you can give this overview to top management, okay? And so it consists of a series of meetings, and I think the best, this diagram that we're going to show next does a good job of displaying that. And typically you do it at the aggregate level, meaning that we're not planning down to the very specific type of product, right? So for example, in Pella we would first off do it by the three major. We had Architect Series, which was a little fancier window. We had Custom, which was really fancy. We had Designer, which was a little bit less fancy. And then we have Pro Line, which is your straight. This is our, for Pella, it was their low end, okay? And so you would forecast by those groups. And then within those groups, you might forecast by doors, double hung, casement, transoms, right? And then you get into product groups. But you typically at this level are not getting into the very specifics of, we're going to produce 1,000 of a 29 by 42 casement window. That's left hinge, right? You're not at that level of detail. You're still relatively high, okay? So, but this whole process is driven by what's your strategic capacity planning? What is it that your firm is saying that they want to do from both, you know, from in the marketplace and in your manufacturing? What is it? What are your goals there? Okay, so you have to come up with what those are, and some, you know, you have some supply network planning that's an input into that. Do you have all the resources that you need in order to be able to accomplish what you want from your supply chain? And then you've also looked at your forecasting and demand management. What do we think we've got coming at us, or what are we forecasting that we're going to be able to do? Okay, and that in conjunction, then you've got sales and operations planning at an aggregate level. So you've got your marketing folks saying, all right, this is our perfect world, this is what we want to do. And then you have your operations folks doing kind of that bump against that to go, yeah, that works, or no, this doesn't. I know I've used the example of the marketing always wanted the 35-inch wide window, right? I've used that example in here before, where that's great, and we eventually want to get to that, but we can't do it this year because that's a $10 million investment, right? And so you have to make sure that you're communicating back and forth with what each are able to do, okay? And out of that kind of back and forth, you come up with your sales plan and your aggregate operations plan. So you're again at this high level. You might be at the casement, double hung doors kind of for each division, right? And then you take that information and you divide it out across your manufacturing. So they come up with what we call master scheduling, which just says, we're gonna take a run at saying, if we're in the perfect world, this is what our production is gonna look like, okay? And this whole, doing the master scheduling for the entire year, basically, I'm talking from, Pella would do it at a year, and a lot of people do that same look. They look at it 1 year at a time. So if you look at it for a year, right, you have some decisions to make. So some of the decisions that we would make is, if volume is going up, are we gonna hire people? Or are we gonna build more inventory in January and February, right? So those are some choices that you have. If you need more people, are you gonna hire full-time people or are you gonna hire temporary people, right? Because the cost of the benefits is significantly different. However, right, if you hire temporary people, sometimes the commitment that you get and the quality that you get isn't the same as if you've invested in those employees and hired them as full-time. So there's all these kind of decisions that have to be made before you can really say, okay, this is our approach, okay? And so then now you've done that part of it and you said, we're gonna hire people, we're gonna work some overtime and we're gonna hire some people. So we've got this hybrid approach. And because of that, now we know what our materials requirements planning is for the next year, right? And you say that with a grain of salt. You're making assumptions about what they're gonna be and you're communicating those assumptions to your suppliers, right? So you're sending that information out. And then as it gets closer to it, you're actually making the orders, right? So you've got the forecasting portion of it, the master scheduling portion of it, and then you get into that, okay, now we're actually doing it. Now we're sending the MRP to our suppliers. And that happens when you schedule the orders in Pella's case. Sometimes it happens before, depending on the system. And in the logistics side of it, you've got, okay, well, what about vehicles? How are we getting things from one place to another? If you're making forecasts by sales regions, and as an example, coming out of Murray, Kentucky, it's a challenge to get trucks to leave from Murray, Kentucky to go to different places. When Pella came here, they thought because PTL was headquartered here that wouldn't be a problem, right? But their headquarters is here, but it's a trailer maintenance and driver. It's not an actual hub. It's not a major hub for them, right? And so transportation is a bit of a problem, okay? So if it's a problem, how are you going to address it? Are you hiring contract carriers? Are you hiring more people so you're a larger private carrier? What are your choices there? And then, again, as you start actually doing things, right, you need to have some way to plan what are we loading on each vehicle, right? That's typically those enterprise resource planning systems. They have a component of it that will do that for you, okay? And then who's dispatching the vehicles? And then what about warehouse receipts, okay? And then over here on services, okay, if you've got a service force, okay, how are you scheduling them? How many of them do you need? And then you dive it down into the daily workforce. So you can see you start at this big umbrella level and you just keep kind of filtering down with the information. The challenge is, and what makes life interesting is, what you think you have here when you plan this in August of 2016, right, looks maybe a lot different when you get to May of 2017. And you're trying to plan kind of that far out when you put that plan together. And so Pella typically makes the choice to make some major adjustments, any adjustments kind of once a month, right? If there's, so we're gonna plan at the beginning of January, we're going off of our budget, this is our plan for how much inventory we're gonna have, we're gonna assess that at the end of January and see where we're at, right? And depending on where we're at, then we may either try to work some overtime to get back on plan if we're short on inventory, or we may try to cut hours if we think we've got too much inventory, right? I told you the story about when Lowe's does their inventory at I think it's like the very last of January, and so we were not getting any orders in from them like the last 2 weeks of January. So our thought was, oh my gosh, we need to really cut hours. Well then, of course, the first week of February, after their inventory was over, we got this huge amount of orders to come through so that they could restock their shelves, right? And so then that cleared out our inventory and we were right back on track. But it's those kinds of things that you're looking at and trying to make adjustments for, okay? So I think, again, I would review that. There's going to be some multiple choice questions on your exam that come out of that diagram, so I'd make sure that you're comfortable with that and kind of how that flows, okay? So in terms of an overview of sales and operations planning, sales and operations planning was coined by companies to refer to aggregate planning. It's meant to capture the importance of sales and operations working together on it. Aggregation on the supply side is done by product families, and on the demand side, it's done by groups of customers, okay? And of course, we've talked about different ranges of planning in here before, but we have long range, typically greater than a year. Intermediate is from 3 to 18 months, and short range covers from a period from 1 day to 6 months. And we say 1 day, that's generally true. Some of the car manufacturers plan in 2-hour buckets, right? And so that's a pretty intense type of scheduling, okay? So your aggregate operations plan, you're looking for the optimal combination of your production rate, how many units you're going to complete, based on how many units you need to complete, what's the workforce level that you need, and then what's the inventory that you're going to have on hand. Because all of those have some different costs associated with them. So what you're trying to do is figure out how can we supply our customer in a way that we're confident we can do, but at the lowest cost and the most efficient way possible, okay? And so again, that planning is typically done for 3 to 18 months out, okay? When you think about a production planning environment, the external environment is anything that's outside the production planner's direct control, okay? In some firms, demand can be managed. One of the ways they can do that, right, is they may adjust their pricing based on where they're at with inventory of certain items, okay? And then kind of another thing to think about is companies that have complementary products work for firms facing cyclical demand. So I think the example that they have in your textbook is snow skis and water skis, right? When the demand for snow skis is high, the demand for water skis is low. They're probably going to use similar types of equipment, and the employees are going to have similar skill sets. So it's not a big transition to go from one to the other. Another good example of that is lawn mowers and snow blowers, right? Again, they kind of have some similarities, okay? And with services, cycles are often measured more in hours than months. I mean, you think about the McDonald's, right? Their cycle is going to be hours at lunchtime, hours at supper time, and whenever else they have peaks. Okay, so when you're doing the production planning process, right, you have a lot of different inputs that come into play, okay? Some just your competitor's behavior. What about raw material availability? What's going on in the marketplace? What are your customers? Are we in a slow economy, and so therefore your sales are impacted negatively, okay? Or you're in an up economy, and therefore, depending on the type of product, your sales are impacted positively. What about, do you have the ability to use subcontractors, right? Sometimes you don't want to use subcontractors. If using subcontractors is going to give away your competitive advantage, that's not really an option, right? And so you have to be very cautious about what things you might subcontract. And then in terms of internal to the firm, so up above what we just talked about are things external to the firm. Internal to the firm, what's your current physical capacity? How much can you produce per hour? What storage space do you have? What current workforce do you have? Is it a problem to hire people? Some areas of the country it's really difficult to hire people. Other areas it's not so difficult because of the way the workforce, there's just a lot of people that are looking for work, okay? And then what are your current inventory levels, and what do you need to happen in terms of to get production, okay? So this is going to be the main gist of what we look at in Chapter 8. And what I'll tell you is I've pulled in some homework from a Swank textbook, because the authors of this textbook, while I think they do a great job on most subjects, they have something that they call the cut and try approach. And I think it's an obnoxious, ridiculous, detailed mess that it's not worth our time. You're not going to get enough out of it for the amount of time it would take for you to be skilled at it. So what I've done is I've gone with Swank, takes a more simplified approach to just say, okay, I want to make sure that you're aware of the different costs that we're trying to balance and how those costs come into play, okay? So that's how we're gonna focus for chapter 8, okay? So this is still from our current textbook, so it ties in because they talk about these different strategies. So you can have a chase strategy, which says, whatever my demand is, that's what I'm gonna produce. So if I get 10,000 units is demanded, that's how many I'm gonna produce. If it's 4,000, that's how many I'm gonna produce. And you're just gonna go up and down following your demand. That's why they call it chase, okay? A level strategy is just the opposite of that. It says, I'm gonna take my total demand and I'm gonna divide that production out evenly across every time period. And so then my workers are always working and they're always producing the exact same amount, okay? And then in between that, we have some hybrid approaches, right? Where I do a little bit of chase and I do a little bit of the overtime or subcontracting in order to meet my demand, okay? So a pure strategy uses just one of the approaches, and a mixed strategy or a hybrid strategy uses 2 or more of the approaches, okay? Again, I think pretty relevant. You'll probably see some multiple choice questions on the types of costs associated with this planning, right? You're gonna have your basic production costs. How much does it cost for me to make the unit? What about your changeover costs? So if I am moving from, 100 units a day to 150 units a day, there's probably some things that I have to do differently, right? We have inventory holding costs, okay? So I can produce things in January to sell in August, but there's a cost associated with that, okay? And what about back order costs? And those are a little bit softer, right? Because there's a potential to lose some customers with those back order costs, okay? So again, they have the cut and try approach. It involves costing out various production planning alternatives and selecting the one that's best. It's elaborate spreadsheets are developed to facilitate the decision process, and that's the truth. They've got some real, so if you want to thumb through your textbook, you'll see some of the examples that they use, okay? Or you can use linear programming. It's mathematical analysis to find an optimal plan. Dr. North does some things specifically on that in his 470 class. He uses Excel and, why am I drawing a blank? There's an optimal solution approach in Excel, linear programming in Excel, okay? Or you can use simulation, where you run a what-if analysis, okay? We're gonna now, you're gonna see the slides are gonna change color, so we're switching over to the Swank approach, okay? So Swank says, again, sales and operations planning, it's how we integrate marketing and operations, and you're trying to balance supply and demand, right? So that's that key function of sales and operations planning, is to try to balance supply and demand. So there's both quantitative benefits and qualitative benefits. Quantitatively, by doing that, you can improve your forecast accuracy just through that communication. It works because you're talking to the marketing area, and it works because you're talking to your suppliers, right? You're sharing that information across the supply chain. Therefore, you can do higher customer service. You have more stable supply because you've shared with your vendors what your expectations are, and you can have better new product introductions. From a qualitative side, you can have better teamwork, faster and better aligned decision-making, because everybody understands kind of what the parameters are that you're working with. Greater accountability for performance and better business visibility, okay? And this is Swank's game plan, right? He says you start out, again, with marketing, and they say, here's the perfect world, here's what we like. And then you come to the operations side, and they say, okay, given your perfect world, here's what we can do, right? And then you balance the plan, right? So it's kind of a 1, 2, 3 approach. Then when you finish, right, these were always fun, you present in front of the executives and say, here's what we think we're gonna do. And if, this sounds, like, the reality of it is there's usually some input from executives in the very beginning. And they're gonna say, in the next year, we expect to see this much improvement. And you can either get it through more sales or through operational, and so then sales and operations does a little bit of headbutting to say, nope, you're responsible for this much and we're responsible for this much, okay? And so this is when they say balance, that's what you're doing, right? You're trying to figure out who's gonna be responsible for what portions of it. And then you go through the financial review and then go to the executive meeting and talk about, okay, what's our different approaches, and then you come away with your one plan. When I worked for Tony Hogan in Story City, he was a really good plant manager. And his conversation was always, the plan is the plan until the plan changes, right? This is what we're gonna do until we say this isn't what we're gonna do. Because one of the challenges that you have if you're not walking this process is salespeople say, we are gonna forecast that we're gonna do $1,200,000 in revenue. And operations people go, they are always overly optimistic, so we're only gonna plan to do $1 million, right? And so then when it comes down to it, and maybe they sell $1.2 million, and you've only planned for $1 million, now you're up shit creek without a paddle, right? And so basically, you're saying everybody's gonna be on the same page here, okay? And so then you execute, and then you learn from what you did wrong. Okay, well, we missed that last year. How did we miss it? What is it that we need to do different next year? And you go through that process, that cyclical process. So I think that's a good overview of that demand planning and operations management, okay? So when we talk about aggregate production planning, right, we've got these costs that we have to consider. We have the holding inventory, the regular production, the overtime, the hiring, the firing and the layoff, the back order or lost sales, and subcontracting. And so today what we're going to work on is we're going to look at some examples given different approaches. How would we actually, what do those costs look like? Okay. So just to give you a visual of what level production looks like. So level production is when the blue line represents your demand. Okay, so it's not flat across the year. But in level production, you're going to produce the exact same amount all the way across the year, okay? And what happens is you start out producing more than what you're selling, so you build up some inventory, right? And then towards the end, what happens is now you're selling more than you're producing, so now you're using your inventory, okay? And of course, this is in the perfect world scenario, right? Nobody ever screws up. It works perfectly. You produce the exact same amount all on regular time. There's no overtime. What happens is if there's variation here, that can affect it sometimes. But again, we're going with the perfect world with the assumptions in place that's how it's going to work. Okay, so on a level production plan, what you're doing is, so here's your formula for it. But the formula for it, don't get hung up on it. Basically what it's saying is, if I have, let's do 10,000 units a month for 12 months, right? That's 120,000 units in total. So I'm going to sum up my entire demand of 120,000 units in total. And I'm going to add to that however many units I want in inventory at the end of that time period and subtract out what I have in it in the beginning. And that's how many total units I need to produce, okay? Now that I know how many units I need to produce, I'm just going to divide it by the number of time periods that I'm looking at, and I'm going to produce the same amount every single month, okay? And we're going to do an example of that here in just a minute. A chase strategy says, I am going to produce exactly what my demand is, okay? What do you notice about inventory when we do a chase strategy? It never changes, okay? It stays exactly the same, because we're saying this is our safety stock. We're just going to hold some safety stock, but we're going to produce to exactly what our demand is, okay? So in a chase production strategy, you change the production to match demand. Inventory remains relatively stable, and you have kind of three options that you can consider, okay? Produce everything in-house and vary the workforce level. This one's called the hire fire approach, and you'll hear me say that again when we do our example. Another one is produce everything in-house. Have your workforce level set to meet the lowest demand period, and then use overtime for anything that's over that. Okay, so that's option 2. And option 3 is produce everything in-house, have the workforce level to meet the lowest demand period, and use subcontracting. Okay, this is an option. We're not going to do it in anything that we look at. Okay, we're just going to use the overtime option. They're exactly the same. You just have to adjust the cost on whether or not you're using overtime or whether or not you're using subcontracting. And then a hybrid is a combination of both level and chase strategies, right? So what I could say with a hybrid is, well, I'm going to produce a certain amount for the first 5 months, and then maybe I'm going to work overtime, and I'm going to do that for a few months, and then I'm going to fall back and produce that same amount again, right? So again, that's a hybrid approach. I'm going to finish out the slides, and then we'll go ahead and do the examples that we've got, okay? So yield management is really an interesting concept. And the airlines were probably some of the first ones to really make use of it, right? Back in the 70s, they were doing all the different pricing for seats. And, you know, it depended on whether you wanted first class, whether you booked way in advance, whether you booked in the sweet spot, or whether you booked the day before you needed to go. So they modify prices to encourage customers to purchase for service at supplier desired times. And so that goal is to maximize revenue and profit. So back to our current textbook, yield management is the process of allocating the right type of capacity to the right type of customer at the right time and to maximize your revenue. It can be a powerful approach to making demand more predictable. We talked about some of this when we talked about the Fast Pass example, right? That's an example of yield management. Another example is when, you know, on the interstate or on the toll roads, and they increase the tolls during the peak times. That's a type of yield management. It's existed as long as there's been limited capacity for serving customers. Its widespread scientific application began with American Airlines computerized reservation system. So that was kind of a big deal back in the day. It's probably not, doesn't seem like such a big deal today because we're all pretty used to it. Okay? So in order for yield management to be successful, and again, I think great opportunity for multiple choice questions from that slide, right? What does it take for yield management to be successful? You can segment your demand by customer type, okay? Fixed costs are high and variable costs are low. That plane is flying whether or not there's 5 people on it or 235 people on it, right? Inventory is perishable. I can't hold the flight for another time period, okay? I can sell the product in advance, so I have a flavor for how much it's actually going to be utilized, and demand is highly variable. So those are the kind of key characteristics for yield management to be successful. An example that comes from your textbook is one about hotels. They offer one set of rates during the week and another set during the weekend. The variable costs associated with the room are low in comparison to the cost of adding rooms to the property. Available rooms can't be transferred from one night to another. Blocks of rooms can be sold to conventions or tours. Potential guests can cut short their stay or not show up at all. Okay? All right. And so again, just another look at that. Things in terms of levers for yield management. When you think about the price being fixed or variable, hotels, airlines, rental cars, cruise lines, that's going to be a predictable duration and a variable price, right? And so again, you see these adjusted pretty frequently. That's going to be kind of your sweet spot for yield management, okay? And the rest is not nearly as sweet, right? Okay. Some kind of rules of the road in terms of yield management. Your pricing structures need to appear logical. If people can't understand the logic, they get aggravated by it. You need to handle variability in arrival or starting times, duration, and time between customers. You're trying to lessen that. You've got to train employees to work in an environment where overbooking and price changes are standard occurrences, right? If you're in a hotel and there are formulas that you can use to calculate how much you should overbook, right? But that formula is going to give you the probability that you're going to be fine. Well, that just tells you that sometimes you're not going to be fine. And so you're going to have to train your employees to handle that situation, to find the guests another hotel room and to work with that situation. Okay? So the essence of yield management is that ability to manage that demand. All right, let's move on to doing the examples. Okay? And so I brought worksheets because I just think it's easier for you not to have to copy it all down. I'm going to hand an extra one down to just one second. right, so our first example, we're just gonna do, we talked about level and chase and hybrid. So we're gonna do a level example of production and figure out how to allocate the cost to it, okay? So the first thing I would look at is if I'm doing a level production plan, if you remember we said that we were gonna sum up all of the demand over the time periods. So when I sum this up, we've already got a 240,000 unit total, okay? So my 240,000 unit total, and I need to account for how much beginning inventory I have. So it would be 240,000 minus the 5,000 that I currently have on hand, right? So that gets me to 235,000. Oh, but by the way, those are all safety stocks. So at the end, I'm going to want 5,000 as well. So basically, that's a net zero, right? I have 5,000 in the beginning. I want 5,000 at the end. So that's a net zero. So I'm going to take my 240,000 and divide by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 time periods. So to produce level, right, 240,000 divided by 6 time periods should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I had that in my head, but I'm looking at, I have some solutions posted over here, and they were at a different plan. I'm like, why is that not tying up? So yeah, it's 40,000. So I'm then gonna just say for level production, I'm gonna produce 40,000 each month. Okay, so that's going to tell me that I'm going to produce 240,000 total. Okay, so that being the case, I'm going to skip over this overtime or subcontracting. That's what that is supposed to say. I don't know if that shows up on yours or not. Overtime or subcontracting. And we're going to work on the ending inventory column. Okay, and the ending inventory column says I'm going to take the beginning inventory, right? So I have 5,000 units in inventory to start with. Everybody see where I'm getting that from? So I've got my 5,000 units to begin with. And I'm going to add to that what I'm going to produce. So I'm going to produce 40,000. And then I'm going to subtract out what I'm going to sell. And I'm going to sell 24,000. And that's going to give me my ending inventory. So it's going to be 5,000 plus 40,000 minus 24,000. So that says that my ending inventory is 21,000. Okay? All right. So, to get to my ending inventory for the second month, what's my beginning inventory for this month? What's that? 21,000, right? Because it's the inventory from the previous month. So it's 21,000 plus, what am I producing? How much am I producing? 40,000 minus how much am I selling? 32,000. So my demand at the end of February, or excuse me, not my demand, my inventory at the end of February is 29,000. Okay? Then I'm going to look at ending inventory for March. My beginning inventory is, holler it, 29,000. I'm going to add my production of, and I'm going to subtract my demand of 32. There you go. So now I have inventory of 37,000. Okay? Beginning inventory for April, the 37,000 from the ending inventory of the previous month, plus 40,000 in production, minus 48,000 in demand, right? And so my ending inventory drops back down to 29,000. Okay? Then I'm going to go May, ending inventory from the previous month, which is my beginning inventory for May, 29,000, plus 40,000 that I'm going to produce, minus 60,000. And again, I'm going to have 9,000 in beginning inventory, plus 40,000 in regular production, minus 44,000. Okay? Everybody on board with how we get inventory? And there's a formula, I think, on your sheet that talks you through that too. Okay, now I need to figure out how many workers I need to have. Okay? And a lot of times what I'll do to keep myself honest is I'll go ahead and type in that I had 5,000 in beginning inventory and I had 8 beginning workers. Okay? And so in my problem information, right, it tells me beginning inventory of 5,000, I have 8 workers, and each worker can produce 4,000 units per month. So if each worker can produce 4,000 units per month, how many workers do I need to produce 40,000 units? 10, right? So I'm going to plug in here, I need 10. How many workers do I need in February? 10. It's level production. So in level production, I need the same amount of workers because we're producing the same amount every month. Okay? And then the question is, do I need to hire or fire any employees? Well, I had 8. What do I need to do? Hire 2, right? And you can't do both hire and fire in a given month. So that's 0. And then for the remainder of my time period, so this works just like inventory. So I had 8, I got 10. I need 10, I had 10 from the previous month. What do I need to do? 0. Right? And that's the way it works all the way down. Right? I no longer, that first month in a level, I might need to do something in terms of hiring or firing. But after that, if I'm producing the same amount every month, I don't have to change the amount of workers that I have. Does that all make sense to everybody? So far, so good? Okay, so what we've done is we've identified those costs that we were talking about, right? Or we've identified the categories of costs. All right, so that being said, now I need to identify my cost per category and come up with a total cost for each category, right? And so here's the thing. This example is just a little funky, and I'm not going to ask you to do this on the exam. So I'm just going to tell you what the answer is, and then you'll just know. So the question is, how much does it cost me to produce a case of product? Okay? So if I were trying to figure out how much it was going to cost me to produce a case, right, what I would do is I would say, well, what's my cost per case? All right? And so if I were looking at that, I might say, well, what's my 1 worker cost divided by how much can he produce? Or she, right? Right? And so what I'm saying is that on regular time, my employee costs me $20 per hour. In a regular month, times 160 hours, perfect. Okay? And that worker can produce how many units? 4,000. So at the end of the day, that's going to be back to
3,200.
Okay.
Divided by 820.
Yep, 3,200 divided by 4,000, or 80 cents per case. Okay. So when you're given an exam problem like this, and you will be, when you're given that exam problem, I'm not going to ask you to calculate that. What it's going to say up here is cost per case or cost per unit, and you won't have to calculate it. Okay. You should be able to, but it's just not something that on the exam. It's not someplace I want to go. So that being said, then my cost is 80 cents a unit, and I'm going to multiply that times 240,000 units produced on regular time, right? So my cost for production of those 240,000 units is $192,000. Okay? Given our current plan, did we have any overtime or subcontracting that we needed to do? We didn't. Okay? This is not like Connect. If you leave it blank, I assume you mean a 0. Okay, so you don't have to fill in a 0 there. But the bottom line is that we don't have any overtime or subcontracting costs. Okay, and then it tells us in our problem, right? So I've used the beginning inventory, I've used the beginning workers, we've used this information to calculate how much a case costs us. Okay, let's see. It tells us that our inventory holding cost is 30 cents per case per month. Okay, So if you were me, how would you go about calculating what our inventory holding costs are? What do you think I need to do? We know that it's 30 cents a case per month, right? Am I going to use it off of the 5,000 that I have at the end? Or do I need to sum all of those up? I need to sum all of them up. That's one of the most common mistakes that people make, is they come to the end and they just take that last inventory, and basically the cost is per case per month. So I'm going to sum those up, and that gives me 130,000 that I'm holding in inventory. If I sum up across each month times 30 cents, tells me that my inventory holding cost is $39,000. Okay? And then this worker column, all it is a tool for you to be able to determine how many you need to hire and fire. We have no total cost that we're doing here. Our total cost, because we've accounted for their cost and the production cost, right? What we're interested in is what's it cost when we hire and fire, right? Because there is a cost associated with hiring and firing, okay? And so it tells us in our problem that hiring is $1,000 and firing is $1,500, okay? And so what I need to do is sum up across both of those categories, right? And so my hiring costs, 2 at $1,000 each, 2,000. Firing costs, I'm not firing anybody. My life is easy, I don't have to fire anybody. And so my total cost of this level production plan comes back to be $233,000, okay? Then the question is there a better way, right? Do we have other options? Do I need to wait just a minute while you finish writing, or are you good for me to go ahead and go on? I'm seeing nodding heads. I asked an or question. Are you good for me to go on? Okay, all right. All right, so now we're gonna look at a pure chase strategy, okay? And that pure chase strategy is gonna, we can either say we're gonna adjust the workforce size, or we're gonna hire and fire, right? It can be called kind of a number of things, okay? In a pure chase strategy, our demand and production are equal to each other in a pure chase. So all I'm gonna do is say, on regular production, I am gonna produce exactly what my demand is. So do I have any overtime or subcontracting? No. Okay. That being the case, I can calculate ending inventory one cell at a time, right? I can say, well, I start with 5,000, I produce 24,000, I sell 24,000, how many do I have left? 5,000, right? I start with 5,000, I produce 32, I sell 32, how many do I have left? 5,000. Do you remember that's that one where that inventory stays flat all the way across? So I don't even really have to in a level, or excuse me, in a chase. I just know that my inventory is going to be the same. I can use the formula to calculate it, but a shortcut is just, in a pure chase, you're producing exactly what you're selling, so your inventory is untouched. And again, I should start out and put my 5,000 in inventory here and my 8 workers here, right? So this is the kind of the beginning. Okay. All right. So if I want to produce 24,000 units, how many workers do I need? 6. And I get that by doing what? I think you said it, I just didn't hear it. Yeah, so I'm going to divide, first I'm going to divide by average monthly output, right? And so 24,000 regular production divided by 4,000 tells me I need 6. And then you said it, I need to fire 2 then, right? I have 8 on hand and I need to fire 2, right? How many workers do I need? Let's just start around the room. Bailey, how many workers do I need in February? Regular production is 32,000, so I'm going to need 8. Okay, Ashley, how many am I going to need in March? Georgia? 12. Right. James? 15, I think, right? 60, okay. Okay, and Karen, are you getting where it's coming from?
Yeah, I can't do the math in my head right
44,000 divided by 4,000 is gonna be 11, okay? All right, so that being the case, let's come back over here. Tell me your first name again. Katie. All right, so Katie, what do I need to do? We fired 2 here. What do I need to do in February?
On the harm section,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
like, are we filling in the fire section or the hire section?
Well, we're just filling in the hire or fire, because it's one or the other,
Yeah.
okay? So what do I need to do? Do I need to hire or fire in February? Sam, what do you
You
think?
don't need to hire anybody.
Okay, but I fired 2 here, so I really only have 6. So I need 8. So I need, were you looking at this one? Yeah, so if you were looking at this one, you were right. I don't need to do anything here. But if I'm looking at it for February, I need to hire 2 because I only have 6 on hand. So in that case, you may want to go ahead and do, if you want to fill in, so that's a 0, that's 2, that's 0. Okay, print, what am I doing in March? 0, okay. What am I doing in April?
Hire 4.
I'm going to hire 4. So the key is go back to the month before. Oops, sorry. I need you to keep me honest. That was a test. Okay. So the key is to just go back 1 month, right? And I reiterate that because that'll be the mistake people will make. They'll go back to this 8, okay? Once we've gone into the first month, we're going back to the previous month to look at that, okay? And so, again, then in, Matt, what am I doing now? Hiring 3, right? What am I doing next? Firing 4, right? And at the end of the day, right, then we come up with this, okay? Now, these were already filled in because we filled them in the last time. Do you want me to go back over where these come from? You feel like you understand? We're getting the hiring and firing costs from up above, right? We're also getting the inventory carrying costs. We have our regular production. The one thing that we didn't talk about is we can use $1.15 for subcontracting, or if I need to figure overtime, overtime is slightly different, okay? So, but in this case, we're not doing either of those, so I'm gonna just leave that blank. Okay, so right now, if we were going purely off of cost, right, this plan cost us $219,000, and our level plan cost us how much? $233,000. So if we were going solely off of cost, what would I do? I would do the chase, I would do the hire fire. Is that all we should consider? No, there's some morale issues to be considered there too, right? If you're hiring and firing all the time, right, it can be a morale issue. And it depends on the industry that you're in. And so they try to account for the cost of the hiring and firing here, but when a chase plan works well is when your costs of training are low, right? Because I can bring on 5 people or let 5 people go, and it takes me almost no time to train them, right? We know some folks that have a large, like a railroad contracting business out of Omaha, Nebraska, and they have about 60 guys that work for him. And every month, his approach is, I'm firing 2, right? And so you don't want to be the bottom 2 because you're going to get fired, right? And he does that because it's a way of motivation. It may not be my favorite way or my preferred way, but when you've got 60 guys and you're in a business where you're competing on cost and you're not paying a lot of wages, right, that's one way to keep people engaged in what they're doing. And I probably would have been, when I was in your shoes, I'd have been a lot softer on that approach than I am after having been in industry. So I have a much better understanding of why someone might make those choices too. It depends on where you're working and the kind of people that you're working with, okay? So, again, that's, but you try to account for that with the cost of hiring and firing. All right, let's look at the next chase plan, okay? And that plan is, we're gonna do that with overtime, okay? And so when we do this with overtime, right? What we do is we find the minimum demand here, and we plan our production accordingly, okay? So our regular production according to that. So as I skim down through here, my regular production is 24,000. And so what I'm going to do then is every month I'm going to produce to that minimum on regular production. And then I'm going to use overtime or subcontracting for the difference. So it's my demand minus my regular production. Demand of 32,000 minus regular production of 24,000 means I need to have 8,000 of overtime. 32,000 minus 24,000 for March says 8,000 of overtime. 48,000 minus 24,000 says I need to have 24,000 in overtime. 60,000 minus 24,000 says I need to have 36,000 in overtime. 44,000 minus 24,000 says I need to have 20,000 in overtime. I'm going to sum all those up and multiply them by my overtime cost, and it's $1.20 per case. Trust me on that. I'll give it to you in the actual problem. Okay? And so then my regular production costs $115,200, and my overtime production also costs me $115,200. What is my inventory going to do through all of this? I start with what? What's up? It's going to stay exactly the same. Because again, this is a pure chase approach, and so that inventory is going to stay the same. It can be pure chase, and I can use it by hire and fire, or it can be pure chase, and I can use overtime. So if I were going to go the long route, I'd go, well, my beginning inventory is 5,000. I'm producing 24,000. I'm selling 24,000. Okay, leaving me with 5,000 in ending inventory. Okay, so I have 5,000 in beginning inventory. I'm producing a total of 32,000, right? And I'm selling 32,000, leaving me with 5,000 in ending inventory. So for a total of 30,000 units in inventory. Okay. So I started out with 8 workers. How many workers do I need for this game plan? I heard it. 6, right? And so what do I need to do in January? Fire 2. What do I need to do in February? Nothing, right? And what do I need to do for firing? Nothing, all the way down after I fire my 2. But you got to remember this. There'll be at least a third of you who will forget that, right? So just make sure that you remember you have to compare it to that very first what you have on hand to begin with. All right? So my total cost for that is $242,400. That's pretty expensive, right? Compared to my $219 for the higher fire. Okay? And then last but not least, right, we could say, well, let's do a mix, right? What if I really am attached to my 8 workers and I want to keep them all the time, okay? If I keep my 8 workers, how much are they producing on regular production each month? Say it, print. 32,000, right? So if I'm keeping my 8 workers, they're going to produce 32,000 each time period, okay? And again, I'm going to either, here's where it gets just a little tricky because it's not quite as straightforward because I have some choices to make, okay? So I calculate my inventory, okay? And so that's where I go next. I input my regular production and then I calculate my inventory, recognizing that I always want to keep 5,000 units in inventory because that's my safety stock. So I start out with 5,000 units on hand. I produce 32,000, so I add 5,000 and 32,000, and I subtract my 24,000, right? That leaves me with 13,000. In February, I start with 13,000 in inventory. I add 32,000 of production, and I subtract out 32,000 in production. I still am gonna have 13,000. Same thing's gonna happen in March. I've got 13,000 units. I'm gonna produce 32,000, and I'm gonna subtract out my demand of 32,000. Okay, now I'm gonna get to April, and I'm gonna produce 32,000. Sorry, I need to be consistent. I have 13,000 units on hand. I'm gonna add the 32,000 that I'm gonna produce, and I'm gonna subtract out the 48,000 that I'm gonna sell, okay? Well, then my inventory goes to negative 3,000. So then, what do I need to do for overtime or subcontracting? That 3,000 plus, I wanna keep 5,000 in safety stock. So I'm gonna add in 8,000 units, and I'm gonna add that to the production here. And so that leaves me with 5,000 units. So do you see it's easiest for me to come over here and calculate inventory and then go, okay, well I need to do safety stock plus whatever I'm short and add that back in, okay? So in this case, I'm gonna start with 5,000 units. And so I can set Excel up to do it this way to begin with. I can say, I wanna add in whatever I'm gonna produce, whether that be overtime or subcontracting. So I'm gonna add my overtime, which currently is at 0, plus my regular production, right? And then I'm gonna subtract out what I'm gonna sell. It's gonna take me to negative 23,000. So what do I need to overtime? 28,000, right? So I'm gonna go 28,000 and do the same thing again here. I've got 5,000 in ending inventory, plus my possible overtime, plus my regular production, minus what I'm gonna sell. Gives me negative 7,000, so I need to have what here? 12,000. Okay, so this being the case, how many workers do I need each month? Goes right back to what we initially said. So you don't even have to fill this in, because the bottom line is we're not gonna hire or fire anybody in this approach, right? We're just gonna keep our 8 workers all the way through, right? And that costs us $227,400. So you kind of get to this and say, are your 8 workers that important to you? You know, so 219,000 versus 227,000. I might say they might be, right? Again, it depends on the business and kind of how that goes. But you know, some things that you'd have to think about. But that's the approach that you're taking. If we were deciding purely on cost, right, we would pick the chase approach. Okay? There's one last piece that I want you to get before we call this a day, okay? And that piece is, let's look at the chase, and let's look at the pure chase with the hire and fire and the level. And let's make sure that you understand what the difference is, okay? So in this plan of 233,000, right? Describe to me why that's more expensive than the hire fire approach. What are we actually saying with that? Why is this more expensive? What drives it to be more expensive?
Is it because you have too many hands and you're paying too many people?
Okay, so in this case, you're on the right track. What I would say is, what's that? Okay, so we've got inventory, right? If we look here, the cost of producing is 192,000. The cost of producing is 192,000. Okay, our ending inventory is 9,000, and our ending inventory here is 39,000. So basically, but if we look at our hire fire costs, they're 2,000 in level, right? And they're basically 18,000 in hire fire. So the comparison that you're making is you're saying, if our chase is less expensive, we're saying that it's more expensive to hold inventory than it is to hire and fire people, because that's what we're looking at here, right? And so, again, I want you to understand the conceptual part of why we're looking at this, right, and the choices that you're making. If we had a different example, and this were actually the less expensive plan, what other consideration would you have to have if you're going to do regular production and hold inventory? What other consideration would you have to have? There's actually a couple that you could come up with. So if I were looking at this plan and said, yep, that's the one I want to do, can I just go check a box and go, let's go do it?
Like warehouse space?
You got it, right? I have to understand whether or not I have warehouse space. And the other thing that I think we have to understand is from when we look at, so this one I think you have to think about warehouse space. And this one I think you have to think about, okay, can they really increase, not this one, sorry, the overtime one, right? Can we really increase like this? We're gonna do 24,000 on regular production, can we really get 36,000 on overtime production, right? I mean, I think there's some reality checks that you have to walk through too. All we're gonna worry about on the exam, I will ask you to conceptually explain the difference between the level and chase. You're gonna solve a problem for level, you're gonna solve a problem for chase, and I'm gonna ask you to tell me why is this one a better choice. And it's gonna come down to because it's either less expensive to hold inventory or it's less expensive to hire and fire, right? And you're gonna have to make that connection, right? So what we're gonna do is, I have this, I've recorded this lecture, so I'm gonna post it up to a YouTube video, probably have it out there tomorrow, so if you're working on your homework, you can come back and reference this. And then we're gonna come back on Tuesday and we're gonna do an exam review, and in the exam review, we'll have another smaller subset of problems to work like this too, so you get another chance to work them on Tuesday. And I'll be around all day Thursday, so if you've got questions, you can swing in, and I should be around on Friday afternoon and Monday afternoon as well. Okay? Other than that, I can't believe I'm saying this already, but have a great weekend, right?